Boker Tov. Today's Daf Yomi is Nedarim Daf Chav Tes Nedarim 29, but we're going to start on Chav Ches on the base, 5 lines from the bottom, with a quotation from the Mishnah that the Mishnah said, if a person says Harei Netius Elu Carbon, if the person uses the phrase and says these saplings are like a carbon, i.e., that they are prohibited to me by a vow, ad sheyiktzatsu, until they are cut down, or this garment, this talis, is a carbon until it's burnt, ein lahem pidyon. It says in the Mishnah they cannot be redeemed. So the Gemara asks the question, U'olam, you mean it can never be redeemed? Amar Mar Bar Pada. So it doesn't mean that it can never be redeemed. So what do you mean that they cannot be redeemed? If they cut down, it says ein lahem pidyon. What does that mean? So Bar Pada explains, Padan chozos v'kachos, padan chozos v'kachos. He says it means that once they're redeemed, they immediately come back and are redeemed again because they're not cut down. So padan chozos v'kachos, padan chozos v'kachos. Whereas once they're cut down, then it niktatsu podam pamachas v'dayo. Then once they're cut down, you redeem them one time and that's sufficient. So Bar Pada says that what this means is every time you redeem them, the kedusha doesn't disappear because they haven't been cut down yet. Until you cut them down, until they cut down, then you have to redeem them one more time and that's sufficient. That's why Bar Pada explains our Mishnah. Comes on Ula, it says kivan sheniktatsu shuvein podim. He says, no, once they're cut down, then you don't need to redeem them again. So it's obviously the case that Ula and Bar Pada are arguing, once the trees are cut down, do you have to redeem them again? The Bar Pada says you do, and Ula says you don't. But what about in the first case? In the idea of if you redeem them before they're cut down, so there Bar Pada says they automatically retain their holiness. What would Ula say in that scenario? So the Ran says, Kasav Harashba Zal. The Ran writes that the Rashba says, the Ula poleg ad Bar Pada ela b'la'achar sheyiktzatsu. And Ula is only arguing with Bar Pada in the case where after they've been cut down. And in that scenario, the Bar Pada wapaka kedusha bichti, that Bar Pada says the holiness does not depart automatically on its own. Ula paka, whereas according to Ula, once it's cut down, it automatically departs, and you don't have to redeem it. But the Rashba says until it's cut down, everybody would say that even though you redeem them, it automatically retains its holiness until it's cut down. And so therefore, Hainu de Katani, this is what it means. Ein lahem pidyon. This is what it means that they have no redemption. The Kibin Shekain, Kasav Zal, the Mehasha Minan, we'll skip the next part of the Ran, where he quotes the Rashba, but instead we want to go down a few lines in the Ran. And the Ran says, and we welcome our dear friend who's joining us, Eric, he's joining us in person. So we go a few lines down from the Ran, in that Ran, and we're on the bottom of 28b, where the Ran cites the Maram Kartaba, and the Maram Kartaba, he says 5 lines from the bottom. He cites the Chacham Gadol Rav Moshe Kartabi. That's somebody who's everyday citation in our Talmud. The Chacham Gadol Rav Moshe Kartabi explains as follows. He says, he argues with the Rashba. Can you imagine somebody arguing with the Rashba? He says, the Bar Pada v'Ula b'tarti pligi. He says, Bar Pada and Ula are arguing in both cases. Baha Talia, that they are both dependent upon each other, both disputes. Meaning to say, the Mishum Desfiro Bar Pada, the Kedusha Apaka Abachti, because Bar Pada is of the position that the holiness does not evaporate on its own, Therefore, he says, "Padan chodesh v'kodesh." That's why he says it's redeemed. It goes back and it's redeemed again. It goes back to its holiness. So that's according to Ramosha Kartabi, the argument is Ua says that if you redeem it before it's not automatically redeemed, where it doesn't go back to its state, whereas Parpada says it does. But everybody agrees, both the Rashba and the Ramosha Kartabi say that Ua and Parpada both agree that in a situation where that they're both disagreeing in a situation where it was cut down, that Ua says you don't need to redeem it, and Parpada says you do. So now we're on the top of 29a. Amar le Rav Hamnuna. So Rav Hamnuna says, Kedusha Shabahan Lehechan Hocha. So according to Ua, who says once it's cut down, you don't need to redeem it. Where did its Kedusha disintegrate to? We're on the top of Chavtes Samad Aleph. Where did the Kedusha go? Kedusha Shabahan Lehechan Hocha. Where did the Kedusha go? Let's say, and this is the question that Rav Hamnuna is asking on Ua. If a person would say to a woman, today you're my wife, but tomorrow you're not my wife, get. Can her Kedusha disintegrate on its own? It can't. She requires a get. So in that case here also, how can we say that the holiness of this tree just evaporates on its own? How does Rav Hamnuna know this? So he doesn't. So the Ran says Rav Hamnuna doesn't have a makor for this. That Rav Hamnuna doesn't have a source for this idea that if you say to a woman, today you're my wife, but tomorrow you won't be my wife, that in fact she requires a get. But he basically says this on his own. He said it from a svara, that it's impossible to imagine that the Kedusha disintegrates on its own. And however, Tosfos says, how does Rav Hamnuna know this? So maybe a condition does help. So therefore, Tosfos explains that the source for Rav Hamnuna comes from Gittin 83b, where the Gemara there has a suffix if a person can divorce his wife for a period of time, meaning to say you'll be divorced for one day, and then after one day, you'll return to being my wife. And the Gemara there explains that once she's divorced, she can never go back to being his wife without another Kedushin. So that's, according to Tosfos, that's the source for Rav Hamnuna's idea. Anyway, we see from here back to our Gemara that Rav Hamnuna is saying that what's a source for the idea that the Kedusha disintegrates on its own? Don't you know from Kedushin, from marrying a woman, that it doesn't disintegrate on its own? She needs a divorce. So Amalei Rava says, we're in 29a, the fourth line, Rava says, Mika medames Kedushas damim with Kedushas aguf. The two cases are totally different. One is a case where the money is consecrated, i.e., the person is consecrated the tree. That's just a monetary holiness. And that meaning to say the monetary is dedicated to the temple, that can disintegrate on its own. Whereas the case of the woman, her whole essence is consecrated to the marriage. She's Kedushas aguf. So we could say, says Rava to Rav Hamnuna, Kedushas damim paka b'chti, Kedushas aguf paka b'chti. The monetary sanctification can disintegrate on its own. But Kedushas aguf, the whole body being consecrated, that can't disintegrate on its own. So that's Rava's question against Rav Hamnuna. So Amarle Abaye challenges Rava's question against Rav Hamnuna. Why do you say that Kedushas aguf for paka b'chti? Abaye says, Amarle Abaye, Kedushas aguf for paka b'chti. You say that if the whole body is consecrated, it won't disintegrate on its own. So, well, just to tell everybody the Mahalach where we are, Ula has said that even if you say this tree, when it falls down, it will be able to be consecrated. Ula says the trees it doesn't need to be redeemed because the holiness of the tree goes away on its own. Rav Hamnuna says, well, why? Rav Hamnuna challenges the Ula. How can the holiness go away on its own? In the case of marriage, a woman would still need a divorce, even if you said you're just my wife for one day, she would still need a divorce. So the holiness doesn't go away on its own. So Rava says, yeah, in the case of a woman, it doesn't need in case of a woman, you would need a divorce. The holiness doesn't go away on its own. But in the case of a monetary consecration, then it would go away on its own. So Abaye says, well, let me even take a step further. Abaye says, he says that Kedushas Haguf could also go away on its own. So Abaye says Kedushas Haguf or Paka B'Kti, not just Kedushas Tam doesn't goes away on its own, but also Kedushas Haguf could go away on its own. V'Tanya, let's say we have the Brisa which says, Shor Zeh Ola Kol Amid Yom. Let's say you have a person says, this ox for the first 30 days, if I bring it to the temple, it will be an Ola. Well, Achar Amid Yom, but after the first 30 days, it'll be a Shlomim. And a Shlomim is not as holy as an Ola, because an Ola is what's called Kodshe Kodshim. It's completely consecrated, the holiest level of an offering, because it's not eaten, it's cool, it's all offered on the altar. Whereas the Shlomim is Kodshe Kalim, it can be eaten by the Yisraelim. So he says for the first 30 days it's an Ola, and after 30 days it's a Shlomim. But why is that the case? Where does the Kedusha of the Ola go? It's the Kedusha Saguf. So we see, it must be that the holiness of the Ola just disintegrates. And so therefore, so too, we should be able to say here, by Kedusha Saguf, the holiness should disintegrate. So why does Rabbah say that the holiness of the Guf doesn't disintegrate? So the Gemara says, no. Why in the case of that Brisa of the ox was an Ola for the first 30 days, why do we say that the Kedushas of the Ola disintegrates? The Amar with me, because he says, listen, my Ola, it's not I'm consecrating it as an actual Ola offering, I'm consecrating the money for an Ola offering. So therefore it's Kedushas Damim. It's just a monetary consecration. And that's consistent with what Rava said, that the Kedusha of Damim does disintegrate. So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, what about the next clause of that same Brisa? If you want to say we're talking about Kedushas Damim, what about the next clause where he says, Achar Ramad Yom Ola Ume'achshav Shlomim? So he says after 30 days, the first 30 days it says Achar Ramad Yom. After 30 days, it'll be an Ola, and from right now, Ume'achshav Shlomim. From right now, it's a Shlomim. So that's the next clause of the Brisa. Now, if you want to say Chada b'Kedushas Aguf, Chada b'Kedushas Damim. If you want to say that one of the two scenarios of this Brisa is talking about where the whole animal is consecrated to be Kedushas Aguf, to be brought as an offering, and the other case is talking about where one case was just consecrated for its money. Hainu, we're on the top of 29b. That's why the author of the Brisa would need to list both cases to teach us. In one case we're saying that the Kedushas Damim disintegrates, and in the other case we're learning that the Kedushas Aguf disintegrates. The Sakadai de Chamina, because you might have thought Kedushas Aguf or Pakabachti, Kedushas Damim Pakabachti. You might have thought that only the monetary consecration disintegrates on its own, but not the Kedushas Aguf. So therefore, Amtu Achi Tani Tarti. Therefore, the Brisa has to list both cases. Eli Amris Idi Kedushas Damim. But if you want to say that both cases are really Kedushas Damim, that the first case where he says it's Ola for 30 days, and then after 30 days it's a Shlomim, that's also a case of Kedushas Damim. Why would you need to list both cases? If you want to say that it from a Kedusha Chamura of the Ola to the Shlamim of Kedushas Damim, it disintegrates Mikedusha Kala. So from the lesser Kedusha, Mikedusha Kala, Kedusha Chamura Tzricha, would you need to say that it disintegrates from the Ola to the Shlamim? It's obvious that that's the case. And so we see from here that the first case was a case of Kedusha Saguf, and the other case was a case of Kedushas Damim. And we're being told that from Kedushas Damim, it disintegrates before going to Kedushas Saguf, and also from Kedushas Saguf. And so therefore we're being told that it's just really Abai is questioning Rava, because Rava said the Kedushas Saguf doesn't disintegrate on its own. But really it does disintegrate on its own. So therefore Abaye is basically saying that the Kedushas Aguf disintegrates on its own. So Tosfos asks the question, V'im Tomar, Amalo Parach Ula, Kamoa Bar Pada, Kedushas Aguf. Tosfos says that this question is also a question on Ula. Well, actually, that's the next part of the Gemara. The Gemara is going to question Bar Pada, but we'll get to that Tosfos in a moment. So the Gemara, therefore, has established that Abaye has a difficulty with Rava. But anyway, Rav Hamnuna had challenged Ula, because Ula had said that the Kedusha disintegrates on its own, and Rav Hamnuna said that the Kedusha shouldn't disintegrate on its own, because we know from the Isha that it doesn't disintegrate on its own. And so therefore, why can this disintegrate on its own? So Rava said, well, no, a woman's case is different. A woman is Kedusha Saguf. But Abai says the Kedusha Saguf also disintegrates on its own. So Ula is basically defended that even if it would be a case of Kedusha Saguf, but in this case it's just Kedusha Damim, and anyway disintegrates on its own. So the Gemara says, let's say this is a question on Bar Pada. So the Gemara says, let's say this price is a question on Bar Pada. So this price shows that the Kedusha disintegrates on its own. And so isn't this a question on Bar Pada? Because Bar Pada says once it falls down, you need to redeem it. And so he says the Kedusha doesn't disintegrate on its own. So therefore, isn't this price a question on Bar Pada? And about this, Tosfos says, this is also a question on Ula. Because Ula also says that the Kedusha Saguf doesn't always disintegrate on its own, because he himself agrees with Rav Hamnuna that the Kedusha of a woman, that doesn't disintegrate on its own. And from our Brisa, it proves that Kedusha Saguf does disintegrate on its own. So therefore, Tosfos explains that the question that Abaye has on Rava is only to refute that which we wanted to say about Ula, that Kedusha Saguf doesn't disintegrate on its own. But we don't really know what Ula says, and it's possible that Ula is of the position that Kedusha Saguf also would disintegrate on its own. So therefore, it's not necessarily the case that it's a question on Ula, but it's for sure a question on Bar Pada. So therefore, since Bar Pada says the Kedusha Saguf doesn't disintegrate on its own, how does he explain our Brisa? So Amarav Papa, Amracha Bar Pada, that what will Bar Pada say? Hachikamer. This is how we explain our Brisa. That we say it as follows: how do you explain our Brisa? How do you explain the conclusion of the Brisa where he says it's an Ola after 30 days, and from now it's a Shlamim? So how do you say that? How do you explain that? You could say im lo amar me'achshav Shlamim. Then la'achar shloshim yom olahavi. That basically he says, if he didn't say from right now it's a shlamim, then after 30 days it would be an olah. That's what he's saying. If he didn't say from right now it's a shlamim, but he says, and after 30 days it's an olah, then it will be an olah. We're not talking about a case where the shlamim disintegrates, the kedusha of the shlamim disintegrates, because he didn't say that. He says if he didn't say it. So midi da'ave omer isha, and if that's the case, it's similar to a case where he says to a woman, "Is God shigli la'achar shloshim yom, become consecrated to me after 30 days." Dim miku deshes. Just like you could say to a woman, become consecrated to me after 30 days and she'll become consecrated. So even though the money disappeared, you say, become consecrated to me with this money after 30 days, with this Bitcoin, so to speak. And then the Bitcoin disappears, but she's still consecrated because that's the halacha. And so to here, we're saying that in this case, the kedusha will apply to this animal after 30 days. But if he says, but from now it's a shlamim, then the kedusha of the olah is not able to be applicable after 30 days, because we're going to say the kedusha of the shlamim is applying immediately and it doesn't disappear. So the Gemara says, Pshita, well, isn't this a little obvious that you can consecrate something and say that this kedusha will take place after 30 days, even though it's not applicable right now? Because we already learned this case by a woman, that you could marry the woman and she become married after 30 days. So why do we need to learn this law here specifically? So the Gemara says, no, Lotzricha, the Bryce is teaching this in a case where the Hadarbe, that he recanted. He tries to get out of it. He tries to recant himself from that situation. So since he tries to get out of that situation, we're going to say, you might have thought that the kedusha isn't applicable. It's still nevertheless applicable. So the Gemara says, well, this is actually a dispute in kedushin in Tesam and Aleph, with respect to a case of a woman who was betrothed. And there's a dispute between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish with respect to the kedushin of a woman. If she accepts the kedushin and she says it's going to be applicable, let's say after 30 days, and then she wants to recant prior to those 30 days, and she accepts the kedushin to another person, Ruvain betrothed. So he says, your betrothal will take effect after 30 days. And then prior to those 30 days, she says, you know what? I actually want to be betrothed to Shimon. So Rish Lakish says she can't recant. And the kedushin to Shimon doesn't work. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan says she can recant, and the kedushin to Shimon does work. And so we could say here that our brisa, which says that you can't recant, that only works according to Reish Lakish, who says you can't recant. But according to Rabbi Yochanan, according to Rabbi Yochanan, who says you can recant, Ma'iko Meimer, Rabbi Yochanan would say you can recant. So if that's the case, why do we have to learn this brisa? So the Gemara says, Afilu Manda Amar Choseres, even according to the one who says she can recant, in general, he says you can recant, that she can recant by the case of kedushin, but here by hektish, where he's trying to consecrate the olah, become consecrated after 30 days, we're going to say hachas shani. Here we're going to say she's not able to recant. He's not able to recant. Why? We have a very important principle. We say damiraso gavoa k'misiraso ahejot. That when you say something, it's like damiraso gavoa k'misiraso ahejot, meaning to say that by hektish you can't recant because when you say something, when you consecrate something with your words to the temple, it's like you literally have done it already. It's not like it's going to happen later. It's like it already happened. And so therefore, even if you don't say Me'ach Shav, the Ran explains, it's as though you had already happened. It's like you already did the kinyan. That's when it comes to like a pledge to the temple, it's as though it happened right away. And so even though it's going to happen after 30 days, you can't recant. The Bavli does not give an explanation for why we say this concept of amiraso gavoa kimisiraso ahejot, but the Yerushalmi does. The Yerushalmi in Kedushin says, if a person says shor zeh olah ubayis hektish, he says this my ox is an olah or this house is hektish. Kana hektish b'kol makom shahu. Then the hektish acquires it. Why? D'chsev Hashem haaretz u'meloah. Because it says God owns the world. By a regular thing, you only acquire something once you actually do a kinyan. But when it comes to the hektish, we're going to say when it comes to hektish, everything is in the domain of Hashem, and so Hashem acquires it even without a kinyan. I want to stop the recording here. First of all, a happy Sigid to people, but can still go on a few more minutes. And also, like to say.